Hello, and welcome to this, our 67th live stream. Ignorance of the invincibly fallacious. This is, of course, a play on our words of our last Monday release, which was the fallacy of invincible ignorance. Uh, Want to welcome all here tonight. It's good to be here. Um, and we've already got a good lineup of questions here, and it's looking very interesting tonight. So, uh, rules are the same as always, which is that super chats have priority, but we do take non-super chat questions also. And we just ask that when you ask a non-super chat question, please put a Q and a colon in front of it, because that's what I look for. I also ask that you only ask the question once, so that I don't get confused as I'm scanning through the questions. And we also ask that if you have a question about a Bible verse or a foreign word, that you let us know what you think either the where they find it in the Bible, as in chapter, book, chapter, verse, or tell me what language you think it's from, so I have a little bit of context to go from. So the more context you give me, the easier it is for me to give you at least a coherent answer. Okay? So with that said, let's get into the questions. And our first question, and we're going to take 5 non-super chats first. And the first one here is from Mechateki Stalinist, and he asks, I've heard that North Semitic version of Yahweh is Howie, which means he blows rather than he is, which scholars say Yahweh is a storm deity. Does Dr. Falk have any opinions on this view? Yeah, I don't place much credit in this view. And the reason why I don't place much credit in this is because the way Semitic languages sort of have, early forms of Semitic writing can drop off final consonants. So Yahweh is often spelled Yahoo in early forms, and even Yah, but it's not really starting off with the Y and going in that direction. So it would be, if this were the case, it would be who, or even worse, huh. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense as far as how the Tetragrammaton, which is the 4-letter name for God, Yahweh, how it developed. So, just on a developmental, say, the history of what we know of the divine name, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, might be possible, but then the he blows is, is it a storm deity? I don't think so, honestly. There are lots of storm deities in say, Levant. Okay, Baal is a storm deity. He's a storm deity. So I think this is a kind of an attempt to sort of connect Yahweh with Baal. But I think that, my personal opinion is that the name Yahweh actually comes from Midian. Moses goes to Midian, encounters Yahweh there, and then brings Yahweh worship back to Egypt. You don't get a lot of storms in Midian, at least not like you get in, say, more north in Levant. In more northern areas, you get some really vicious storms, but not so much in that area. Occasional sandstorm, but it's not something that I would expect Midianites to sort of make part of their myth. They don't have a storm cycle. They don't have a storm cycle in the way that, say, you find at Ugarit. At Ugarit, there's definitely the Baal storm cycle there, and even in most of, say, the northern Levantine region, there's definitely that storm cycle. But that's not so true in, say, southern Levant. So I have reservations here, essentially. I would need more evidence. Really, I would have to need a lot more evidence for me to sort of buy into this. All right? So that's my opinion on it. Thank you very much for the question. It is an interesting question, but I just don't place a lot of stock in this. Not at the moment. I think there's better explanations for the origin of Yahweh than Yahweh. All right. So thank you very much. Okay. Our next non-super chat comes from M. Scotty. How would you address the problem of evil? Ooh. Yeah, with libraries. Well, here's the problem. You have to the first question you really got to ask here is, which problem of evil? There's many problems of evil. There's not just one. Most typically, you've got the theist, and then you've got the atheist problem of evil. There's two problems of evil. And once you start realizing that there's that evil is a problem not just for the theist, but for the atheist, then you know here you've just got a problem in general. It's a problem for everyone. In the case of the theist, if God is all good and he's all powerful and evil exists, then he's neither all good or he's not all powerful, therefore he doesn't exist. All right. That's the classical theist problem of evil. The atheist problem of evil is, well, how do you define evil? Well, the atheist has to double down and say, well, evil is real. Okay. How do you define it if it's real? And if you cannot define it, then is it real? And if it isn't real, then you've got a defeater here to the theist problem of evil. Because then you've got, well, an all good God can exist because evil isn't real. It's an illusion then. So, it's a problem for them too. They have to maintain, for them to maintain the theist problem of evil, they have to maintain the reality of evil. And if they maintain the reality of evil, then they either have to be able to define it, which they can't do, or they have to admit that evil then is an illusion, and if it's an illusion, then that's a defeater to the theist problem of evil. Evil's just a problem. It doesn't matter what side, which problem of evil you're referring to. It's a problem for both sides. So generally, I don't address it. It's sort of outside of my field. I think this is something that philosophers of religion have thought about for many, many millennia. Problems of evil in literature go back all the way to Celsus. So these are really old arguments. These go back to like the 1st century. They're incredibly old arguments. The responses to them are almost equally as old. So, there is a whole lot here that's going on. And it's probably one of the trickiest problems in a lot of respect. And it keeps getting reformulated. And both sides reformulated this. Have reformulated these problems several times. So, it's not something I usually address. I don't usually address philosophical problems because I'm not a philosopher. I'm an ancient Near Eastern specialist. But, I have some training in philosophy, so I am able to at least appreciate the problem from both sides of the divide. So, anyway, that's how I would engage it. Thank you very much for the question, and I hope that helped. Okay. Our next question comes from Warrior of the Most High, and he asks, does the contradiction of 2 Samuel 21:19 and 1 Chronicles 25 affect the inspiration of the Bible in any way? Some try to use this to dismiss the Bible as the Word of God. Okay. Let's take actually the older passage first. 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 25. All right. This is maybe 2 Samuel. In Samuel 21:19. Okay, yeah. This is, I think. Okay. I'm not really sure here what you mean by the contradiction, honestly. You're not. Neither of these passages, I think you're trying to get at that there is the two Goliath passages. I think. Let's look this up. I think you mean the 1 Samuel 17, where Philistine named Goliath is killed by David. Okay? Because really, 2 Samuel 21:19 and 1 Chronicles 25 actually record the second giant being slain by Elkanah. Okay? And that's what I normally hear is the contradiction. I'm not aware of any contradiction between 2 Samuel 21:19 and 1 Chronicles 25. But if there is a contradiction here that that I'm not aware of, just place that down in the live stream, and we'll answer that. But I'm not aware of a contradiction between the two passages you cited here. So we have David slaying a giant in 1 Samuel 17 as a young man, before he's fully adult. He comes there to serve his three older brothers in the war of Saul against the Philistines. Okay? So you've got that first. Okay? Then you get the 2 Samuel passage. And that comes later chronologically. And I'm going to pull this one up. I'm going to bring up the Bible. $19. All right. Let's see, where's a good place to start? It is a little. Okay, we're going to start at verse 15 here, because this gives us the context of what's happening here. Now, when the Philistines were at war again with Israel, David went down with his servants with him, and as they fought the Philistines, David became wary. Now, here's the context. This is not Saul's war. This is now David's war. And he's past his prime. Verse 16. Then Ishbi-Benob, who was among the descendants of the giant, the weight of whose spear was 300 shekels of bronze in weight, was girded with a new sword, and he intended to kill David. Okay. So what we have here is actually descendants. Okay. Now, descendants of the giant. We're not actually told which giant it is, but it's might not be. This is probably a good 40 years, 20 to 40 years since his encounter with Goliath. And verse 17, but Abishai, son of Zeruiah, helped him, and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swore to him, saying, You shall not go out with us to battle, that you may not extinguish the lamp of Israel. He's too old to fight. He's essentially too old to fight. Verse 18. Now came about after this that there was war again with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Hushite struck down Saph, who was among the descendants of the giant. Now, these are the descendants of either, Goliath or one of his brothers. Okay? So this is like, as I said, 40 years, possibly 40 years after the original duel between David and Goliath. So these are the descendants of that family. Verse 19, and there was war with the Philistines again at Gob. Elhanan, the son of Jere-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Okay. Yeah, these giants love big spears. So the idea is that there's a contradiction here over who killed Goliath. But there's an assumption. There's an assumption in that contradiction. And that assumption is it's the same Goliath. That's quite an assumption. It may be not. This may be a family name. Goliath might be a family name. That's passed down to several descendants. Who knows? Maybe Goliath was the name of the clan chief. That's possible. And if he's the clan chief, then that name is definitely going to get passed down to the next generation. So there's that. You have to be careful that you're not baking in that assumption that just because a name is shared, that it is the same person. We see this, for example, like Ephraim. We see Ephraim in the book of Genesis. And then he shows up in Chronicles. Much later after the Israelites come into the promised land. Oh, it's a contradiction. Because you have Ephraim in Genesis, and then 300 years later, he's now in the promised land. Can't be the same person. Therefore, it's a contradiction. Well, okay. These names were not. These names were shared, passed down generation after generation after generation. We find some of these names even, predate the Bible. Like Jacob. Jacob's not original to the Bible. It's a name that goes back, 1,000 years before the Bible was ever put to pen. It's just continuously being reused. I know it might come as a surprise to my audience, but I'm not the first David. Hey, I'm David? David's in the Bible? It must be a contradiction. There only has to be one David, right? There is an element of incredulity here. And it would make sense that the same name would be passed down in the village of Gath, in the region of Gath, because it's a city of Philistines. It's a family. They had tribal and clan affiliations also, so this stuff got passed down. So that's how I would respond to this. This is not a contradiction, but this is a family name that's passed down to the next generation, and now we see through the 1 Samuel 17, where there's the first encounter when David is a boy, and the second encounter in 2 Samuel 21 when he's an old man. And now he can't fight a giant. He can't fight a giant. Others have to save him. Because he's old. The new generation. A new generation of Philistines and a new generation of Israelites who have now picked up arms. So anyway, that was a great question. I hope I answered that question. Thank you very much for the question. It was actually a really excellent question. Okay. Next question is from Magnificent Universe. Does Jude 6 to 7 say that angels committed sexual immorality? Um, no, but we'll explain why. I've heard that Greek says that Sodom and other cities with it committed sexual immorality just like them, masculine, which implies angels. Okay, that's actually not what's going on here, but let's get into the text. That always helps. So let's get into our text. Jude. And actually, we have to be when we look at some of these epistles. One of the things we have to be careful in Greek, and this is one of those gotchas in Greek, is that you have to find out where the main verb is. If you don't find the main verb, you can't find out what some of the rest of the verses mean. And while we're talking here about Jude 6 and 7, the main verb of this goes all the way back to verse 3. Okay? So you have to keep that main verb in your head, that main clause, that independent clause, so that when you start going through the rest of the passage, you can figure out what it actually means and what it says. Okay. And here's the main verb. Here's the main clause in verse 3. Beloved, while I was making every attempt to write you about our common salvation, I felt it necessary to write to you, appealing that to contend earnestly for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. Okay? The main verb here is to write. The purpose here is to write to you, appealing to you to contend earnestly for the faith. So, with that, you have to put everything now that follows in that context. Okay. Now, verse 4. It's a subordinate clause. Certain persons have crept in unnoticed. Those who were long beforehand marked for this condemnation, ungodly persons who turn the grace of our God into licentiousness and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. Okay? Now, verse 5 is also a subordinate clause. Now I desire to remind you, though by you all things once for all, that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who didn't believe. Okay, so you've got this structure here. You've got this, we want to write to you to contend for the faith, but certain people have crept in and are causing problems. So God brings some people out of Egypt and destroys others who denied the faith. Okay? Then we get into your question, your two subordinate clauses in verse 6 and 7. Also angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. He kept them in eternal bonds under darkness for judgment of the great day. Okay, so same deal here. Angels, some obeyed, some didn't. You know, they got their judgment, just like the people of Egypt who came out of Egypt. They had their judgment. Okay? Verse 7, and then another subordinate clause. Also as, or just as, Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they, in the same way as these, indulged in gross immoral. And these here is demonstrative pronoun referring back to Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities around them. Okay, it doesn't refer back to the angels, it refers back to the cities. Okay, as these being the unbelievers, the ones who turned away, went after strange flesh, exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Okay. So, the text is not saying that the angels committed sexual immorality. It's saying that the people of Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities around them did. And in the way were reserved for judgment, just like those angels, and just like those who disbelieved coming out of Egypt. So we have three parallel subordinate clauses that sort of link to a sort of a higher up subordinate clause that then link to the main clause. Okay, so that's what's happening in this structure, in this textual structure here. Is you got that main clause that's saying, "I want to write to you to contend faith, earnestly for the faith," because bad people have crept in, and here's 3 examples of what happens when the bad people creep in. Okay? You have the people who came out of Egypt. Some were good, some were bad. You had angels. Some fell. Some are good, some are bad. Then you had the Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, all those cities were bad. Boom. God didn't spare them. Okay? So, the takeaway from all of this is once you've established the independent clause, you can then do the proper exegesis of the passage to figure out exactly where does everything fit contextually. Because Greek sentences are hierarchical. They have a hierarchy, and you sort of have to almost map them out to figure out what's being said. This is a very, very common feature of first century Greek. This is one of the reasons why the church fathers can be so difficult to read sometimes, is because they'll give you a lot of preamble before they get to the point, and then a huge exposition after. We find, for example, in, say, certain books of the New Testament, single sentences that are like 20 verses long, 2 chapters long. We cut them into smaller chunks for easier digestion in English, but we do so at the cost of losing some of its expository power. Because we don't see the structure, and because we don't see the structure, we don't always understand what the context, where the context begins and where it should end. So anyway, that's a great question. I hope that helped. Thank you very much for that question. So the short is, no, it's not implying that the angels committed sexual immorality, but it is implying that they're not spared. Just like the people of Egypt not spared, just like Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't spared. They're all being punished for different reasons. The reasons aren't the same. Sodom and Gomorrah isn't doing things for the same reason that, say, the angels did it, which in turn isn't doing it for the same reason as Egypt did. People coming out of Egypt. We know very, very clearly that Egypt was those who came out of Egypt were destroyed for their idolatry, not say their sexual immorality. So, again, that's what's going on in this passage. So thank you very much for that very interesting question. All right, and our final non-super chat for the beginning here is from Cole Walker. Are you going to watch The Rings of Power? No. Thoughts going in? Oh, look, I might watch it. But I'm going to need a lot of whiskey. And no, I'm not drinking whiskey tonight. This is ginger ale. But I need a lot of whiskey to get through Rings of Power. I have heard such bad reviews about the first episode. It just isn't even funny. Yeah, they don't understand. They don't understand Tolkien. But then again, they didn't want to understand Tolkien. They wanted to make their own story. And the producers have been very, very clear about this, that they're not trying to recapture the Tolkien story of the Second Age. They were trying to do Tolkien the way they thought Tolkien should be. Oh, yuck. Yuck. Yeah, that's... And frankly, I don't think all the visual effects in the world can save this pig's breakfast. I think it's just on a collision course for absolute failure, and it's going to be a cringe fest. Yeah, it's really going to be a cringe fest. So anyway, that's my opinion of it. I might watch it when it comes when the season's done, but it's going to. I don't know if I'm going to enjoy it, honestly, because I don't think it's going to do it justice. Now, I have seen some prequels that have been excellent, but this is not. I don't think this is going to be one of them. This is not going to be one of them. The Dark Crystal prequel, I actually really enjoyed. I'll be very honest. When that came out a few years ago, I thought that was excellent. But yeah, the ones that have come out lately, not so good. Not so good. All right. So, the next one. We're now going to start off with the super chats. And our first one is from Brick Creation for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. Any ancient Near Eastern prophetic literature outside the Bible that has amphibole, double meanings, any sources to read up on? Okay. You don't see it discussed a lot in literature, but there is a lot of it outside the Bible. A lot of it. The prophetic texts of Egypt are very, very much full of amphibole, like Nefertiti, prophecy of Nefertiti, the admonitions of Ipuwer. Both those texts are full of, say, Middle Kingdom amphiboles. Just some really interesting amphiboles, too. Like, there's one where it says Semites infiltrate the Ketem fortress because of the exact wording of that was because of the moral failure, of the failure. And that word failure has two meanings. One meaning is that the people coming in were morally wretched. Okay? But it also has the idea of iniquity. So it could have been because of the moral failings of the Egyptian people. So you have that really interesting double meaning in there. So we do have that in Egyptian, and we find it in multiple places. It's not just in that one place. But that's the one example that pops up to mind that where you find it. It is you do find it a lot in Egyptian. I have heard other say scholars talk about it in Assyrian literature also, so it's possibly in there as well. There was somebody was putting together a little conference, a little sort of not conference, discussion group within a conference. I talked to a scholar who had listened to one of my papers, and she was fascinated by the amphibole thing and wanted to invite me to a literature section at SBL, but that sort of never went off. But it's something scholars do talk about. It's something that scholars do talk about, especially ones that are sort of more into, say, the literary genres. I don't know if there's any specific papers or books on it, though. So it's sort of something you just sort of you pick up as you work with literature. But, you start looking for it, especially when you read the languages. That's where you start noticing it. And you start noticing it when you go, like in Egyptian, there's some vagueness to some of the words. Languages that have more, that have a broader semantic range, you see this a lot more. Egyptian can have a broad semantic range. Hebrew has an incredibly broad semantic range. Basically, the way Hebrew sort of gets around having an almost overbroad semantic range is to reduce the range through repetition. Okay, but that gives, say, Hebrew writers the ability to not repeat themselves and to leave those passages with that ambiguity. And when they have that ambiguity, you can get multiple readings happening at the same time. So that's then becomes an artistic choice of the writer. And that's one of the things that I really love about Hebrew literature too, is it has an incredible virtuosity to it. And they're using this virtuosity intentionally. So, anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, our next super chat comes from the creation again. Thank you very much for the super chat. And I see he just put in the comment, I see Mr. Empty Conjecture chilling in the background. Yep. Mr. Empty Conjecture is chilling in the background over there. We like Mr. Empty Conjecture. Okay. And he asks, is the kingdom of this world in Revelation 11:15 singular? If so, what kingdom would it be referring to? The kingdom of the Antichrist. The word for kingdom is cosmou, meaning all creation. I pull up that up. And a lot of New Testament questions tonight. All right. And the verse reads, and the seventh angel sounded, and there arose loud voices in the heaven, saying, the kingdom of the world has become of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. Okay. This is not referring to the kingdom of the Antichrist per se. And what it is referring to is that the whole world is fallen. And that the purpose of, say, the kingdom of Christ is to become Lord of every portion of creation. So, I think this is much more a meaning of, say, the kingdom of creation. Say, the domain of creation. It's probably might be a better way of even saying this. Is that I mean, creation is a domain. And when we look at, for example, Genesis chapter 3, with the fall of man, and Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, God retreats from the world and makes his sacred space in Eden and the rest of the universe, the rest of the world, the rest of the created order, falls. It falls to say other spirits, other forces, to mankind. The lordship of God has to withdraw, so he doesn't react in sort of a vengeance type way against all evil and all sin. Okay? This here is an allusion to Christ reconciling the world to himself, so that all the world becomes the domain of Christ, the domain of God, instead of the domain of the world. And this is that aspect of the world where it is not necessarily just the created order, but this is the fallen created order. So that's what's going on here. It's not a specific allusion to the Antichrist or his kingdom, but it's a specific allusion to, say, the fall. The fall, the Garden of Eden, and that original problem of sin. So that's what's being referred to here. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. I very, very much appreciate it. Our next question here is from 501 Mobius for $10. Good to see you tonight. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. What were the Amara West? I think you mean the Amara West, not the Amarna or Armana. It's Amara West temple inscriptions for, and why is Sierra and Shasu mentioned in a temple in Nubia? Interesting. I don't get questions about the Amara West temple very often. Okay. At certain times in the Egyptian hegemony, not really an empire, it's a hegemony, they had managed to extend their control all the way into Sudan. basically Amara is modern day Sudan. And we see, for example, that hegemony, and essentially Egypt establishes a viceroy over the sort of the region of Nubia. And we see this happen, for example, under Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III establishes say a boundary temple. These are boundary temples. These are temples to show that, hey, this is our influence. This is how far our influence is going. Okay, all the way into Nubia. And if you cause any problems, say north of that temple, we'll come down and we'll break skulls. So that's what the purpose of these temples were, whereas they were reminders to the local population about the power and hegemony of Egypt. Now, interestingly enough, most people talk about the Soleb Temple, and that's because you have the Shasu of Yahoo. Some people say Yahweh, it's really Yahoo, but okay. So you got that at Soleb, okay? And that dates to the reign of Amenhotep III. But the Amara West Temple is built by Ramses II. But what's interesting about that particular temple, and I actually think the Amara West Temple is actually more interesting because the inscriptions here are more complete. Some have suggested that what Ramses II did was he took the inscriptions from the Soleb Temple, which had fallen into disrepair, created the Amara West Temple, and then copied those inscriptions onto the Amara West Temple. Now, what makes the Amara West Temple so fascinating is we have, at Soleb, we only have, say, the Shasu of Yahweh sandwiched between two other captive circles, okay? The Shasu of Turabaru and the Shasu of Samata. Okay? But at Amara West, the Shasu of Yahoo is in a section of 7 captive circles, and that is really interesting because that helps us pinpoint exactly where the Shasu of Yahoo were located. The first in that list is the Shasu of Seir, or Mount Seir. We know this as Mount Seir in Edom. So this tells us that basically because these captive circles are done in sort of geographic sequence of how they were encountered, that we can figure out that the Shasu of Yahoo are really, really close to Mount Seir. They're really, really close. So, this tells us that that those tribes of Shasu are all in Edom. So they're Edomites. They're actually in sort of the region of Edom. So when we look at, say, the Amara West Temple and even Soleb Temple, that's the importance here. And they're basically recounting the campaign of Amenhotep III, as he did that campaign in basically the southern Levant. He's hitting places like Ashkelon, and he's actually going into Edom, and possibly even as far as Moab. So it's very, very interesting because this is not a campaign we have a whole lot of information on. We have records of really only an official record of a campaign in year 6 of Amenhotep III. But he must have also done other campaigns as well. Because almost any time a king comes to a throne, he goes on campaign. He has to. He has to show everyone who's the new king on the block. And if you rebel, there's going to be problems. So almost every king of the new kingdom after, say, Tutmosis III is going to go on campaign and is for 5 years. It's almost obligatory. And this is no less true, probably, of Amenhotep III. We only have, as I say, year 6 campaign for him, but this could have been from an earlier campaign. And it's a very interesting choice of campaigns, because it's not a campaign that that Egyptians normally do. We don't see another campaign, say, done by Egyptians in that southern region of Edom, Moab, and Midian until Ramses III. Ramses III is going to be the next sort of king that actually campaigns into those regions. So it's a very, very unusual campaign. It's an unusual route. So, that's probably the reason why it was recorded there. It was basically a reminder to the Nubians: hey, you rebel, we're going to come and we're going to do to you what we did to Edom. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. It's a very, very interesting question. One of the interesting things about this too is, there's one of the interesting things about this as well, which I find very fascinating, is when you also take this into account as to that campaign of Amenhotep III. Where were the Israelites? Well, they were told to not go to Edom and not go to Moab, but go around and into the Judean foothills. So it's interesting when you think about it, as this coincides with what's happening in the biblical account. They're sorry, I'm getting mixed up here. The Israelites are still in Egypt at this time. I'm getting that the Amara West temple is Ramses II, so I'm getting a little confused here for the moment. I've been doing too much looking into the early Exodus dates, so I'm getting like fuzzy at the moment. Okay, never mind. Okay. But what we will find, though, is that the Israelites will actually go around this region. They're going to go around this region of Edom and Moab, and they're going to circle around and go in through the Heshbon, Arar, and the was territory that's been occupied by the Amorites. Okay, so that's what's going to happen geographically. So this is also why I also don't think that, say, Mount Seir Shasu of Yahoo are the Israelites. I don't think the two are the same. These are different groups. Okay, so yeah. Wow, that was that was awkward. Okay. Teaches me for drinking ginger ale instead of whiskey. Time to go on to the water. All right. Anyway, I hope through that muddled mess you it helped somewhat. I do appreciate the super chat. Thank you very much. It's a good question. It's an interesting question. It's one I don't get very often. The Amara West Temple is actually a better preserved portion of the text that we find at Soleb. So it's an important text. It's an important text, and it tells us a lot about Edom. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I very, very much appreciate it. Nice apologia. This is not as... He says, Dr. Falk having a Freudian slip, secret early date supporter. Yep, you caught me. Oh, very much having a Freudian slip, having a senior moment. Very much having a senior moment. Yeah, it happens to me too. All right. Well, you get all this stuff packed in your head, and then it gets all jumbled up, and it's just like, okay, slips will happen, but it's better it happens here amongst friends. Okay, so, definitely having a senior moment. All right, let's go on to the next super chat. Here. All right. Brick Creation for $20. Thank you very much for the super chat. Any evidence Moses or Egypt conquered Ethiopia before the Exodus? If so, what time would it have been done? I think Josephus, the Ten Commandments movie, also said so, though I don't know where he's getting his sources from. All right. Egypt never conquered Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in would have been in ancient times called Punt. Egypt conquered Nubia, but it never went further south than Nubia. So it sort of stayed away. It had trading relationships with Punt, but it never conquered Punt. During the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, there's a major trading mission that's repeated actually several times subsequent to her with Punt, which is Ethiopia. But there is no evidence that Egypt or Moses ever conquered it. Now, the other thing we have to keep in mind, too, was that Moses wasn't a soldier, at least not as far as we know. He was raised in the household of the vizier, probably the house of Ramses I at Avaris, at the royal palace at Avaris. Now, the royal palace at Avaris is not the same place as where the king resides. Gotta keep that in mind. The king at this particular point in time was living in Thebes. The capital is not going to move to, say, near Avaris until Ramses II. And there really isn't going to be a royal residence at the in that area until Seti I. So by that point, Moses has left the country. Okay, so when he's adopted by the person who would become daughter of the king, you know, she is at the time daughter of vizier, or maybe, maybe the granddaughter of the vizier. Who knows? But there's the blood relationship here is with the vizier, not directly with the king who's ruling in Thebes. So that means he is growing up. He is growing up at Avaris in probably the palace that was constructed for Horemheb, and that's the residence of the vizier. Now, I have to understand that these palaces were built all over Egypt. Okay, they're basically like administrative buildings. They sometimes served as, say, residences for the king when he had to go on tour across Egypt, which happened. There was a religious tour that the king had to sometimes do up and down Egypt, but he never stayed at them for long periods of time. It was basically, a temporary hotel for him, but it served as administrative buildings. Your local governors would be there. Yeah, they're the equivalent of the Department of Motor Vehicles, the DMV. Okay. So, at most, Moses would have probably been trained as a scribe, having lived in, say, the palace of Horemheb at Avaris, but he wouldn't have had any contact with the king because the king didn't live there. Maybe he might have met Horemheb. Might have, it's possible he might have met Horemheb. It wasn't. He didn't grow up in the same house as Horemheb, because the harem, the diplomats, even the vizier of southern Egypt would have all been at Thebes. Okay, or Upper Egypt. That would have all been all that would have taken place at Thebes. So the seat of the imperial the imperial capital was at Thebes, and that's sort of where the king would have stayed. So there's in no sense any sort of inclination that Moses was part of the military, or at most he probably would have been an administrator, which is why he would have visited the work site where the sons of Israel were working. Was because he would have been an administrator. He would have been a scribe. He worked in the DMV. He was a government clerk. He's a bean counter. He's a bean counter. But that's what happened to the sons of kings, of like second sons of kings or sons of viziers. You know, they became administrators. They became scribes. That's what you did with them. So this is where Moses would have learned to read and write. He would have learned to read and write here. He would have learned, how to write in Akkadian. He would have known how to do diplomatic correspondence, write treaties. He would have been fluent in both the languages of Egypt and, say, the Levant. And he would have been at least able to negotiate, say, just the sort of bureaucracy of Egypt. But he wasn't a fighting man, not as far as we know. The fact is that kings, high officials, didn't normally send their sons to war. It was really unusual when this happened. Now, the sons of kings were trained for war, okay? And they often went on campaign because they'd have to take up war one day. But it was a little difference between, putting your son under the care of a trained general versus having your son be the general. Now, there were exceptions. There were sons of kings that were trained for war, that were very good at war, that enjoyed the martial lifestyle. Merneptah was one. He was a general. But he was also 13th in line for the throne. Nobody ever expected him to make it to the throne. Yep. He was expendable. And he would have probably had the choice between becoming an administrator and becoming a general. He chose being a general. There was some option to which sort of path you took. Kahemwasit, another son of Ramses II, becomes a scribe. He becomes an administrator, and a very important one. There are sort of career choices people do take. But I don't think Moses would have been a soldier. And least of all, I don't think he was a general. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And I'd also add here that Josephus is not a good source. He's a terrible source for anything dealing with ancient history. I mean, he's a good source for things that happened, say, within 200 years of his time. So, the what's it called now? The Maccabean revolt. He's probably fine. The Roman rule. He's probably fine. Definitely the Jewish revolts. He's our best source for the Jewish revolts. He's even a good source for, say, the historicity of Jesus Christ. He's terrible when it comes to the Exodus. Absolutely awful. And I see too many, apologists try to use Josephus to make claims for the Exodus that is just really cringeworthy. Really cringeworthy. So anyway, I don't know what more to say. I think people should stop. Keep using Josephus for your New Testament stuff. Stop using him for your Old Testament stuff. He's not good. He's really, really not good here. And some of that is because he's sort of tinkering with the sources to prove a point. So, Camel Leopard. Camel Leopard says, "You're telling me that at Exodus, gods and kings lied when they showed Moses fighting in the Battle of Kadesh? Unfathomable." No, he was not at the Battle of Kadesh. He was already wandering Midian at the time of the Battle of Kadesh. Okay? He has to leave during the last years of Horemheb. So he's not at Kadesh. He's skedaddled. He's fled justice at this point. Okay, so he's gone. he vamoosed. So no, Moses is not at the Battle of Kadesh. Okay. So again, let's get back to the super chats. So anyway, thank you very much, Brick Creation, for that great super chat. There's no evidence that he was a soldier. Egypt did not conquer Ethiopia, and Josephus is a terrible source. But I do very, very much appreciate the super chat. Very grateful for your support of this channel. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate it. You do help us a lot on this channel, and I really appreciate it. So thank you so very much. Okay, our next super chat is from Recreation, and it's actually a super sticker. Wow, no question. Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it. You know, your support really does help our channel, and I hope we give you a good service in return by providing answers, and some that are maybe even right. Anyway, I really appreciate the support. Thank you so much for the super sticker, and you know, and you do give us a lot of great questions too, which gives everyone food for thought. So, thank you so very much. Okay. Our next super chat here comes from Carlo for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. If one has, and I'm presuming you mean less than 4 hours a week, to become as biblically literate as possible, what would you recommend doing? Okay. What I would recommend doing, and here's what I would say about this, is it is possible to become biblically literate in under 4 hours a week. Spend half hour to 40 minutes a day, okay, reading. Now, what I would say is don't sort of confine this to 4 hours in one shot, sitting. Spread it out over the week. So you're doing this every day of the week. And you want to do this every day of the week so it becomes a habit. 45 minutes a day. 45 minutes a day, even a half hour a day. You can actually accomplish a lot in half hour a day if all you are is focused on reading. Read the Bible. Read scholars who talk about the Bible. Both scholars that you agree with and scholars you disagree with. I think it's important to read both. Scholars you agree with and disagree with. That way, the scholars you agree with can, help build up your faith, while the ones you disagree with can also help you build up your faith by challenging your faith. Challenging it with new ideas, objections you might not have considered. So I think it's important to do both. Read historical sources. Church fathers are excellent. I would highly recommend reading church fathers, just for a different perspective on how, say, people viewed various books of the Bible in the first century, in the earliest days of Christianity. There's a lot of ways to become biblically literate. And it can be done in half hour, 45 minutes a day. But you should do it every day. And if you do it every day, you'll notice 2 months down the line how much things change. Read a passage of scripture, then read something else. And it's really, really important to get into that habit of filling your head daily with content. And I mean content here is reading content. I don't mean video content. I mean read. This is really important. You're not going to do this by listening to sermons. You're not going to do it by, say, listening to, say, YouTube videos, as much as I think, YouTube videos are very helpful. If I didn't think they were helpful, I wouldn't be doing this one. Okay? Okay? I think they're helpful. But if you've got a really small sliver of time and you want to become biblically literate fast or faster, there's no shortcuts. You are going to have to put in the reading. do it every day. Read every day. Read the Bible every day. Read scholars every day. And make it a part of your daily routine. Half hour to 45 minutes. And you'll start seeing results. So, anyway, thank you very much for that super chat. I really hope that helped. It's doable. It's really, really doable. And you'll find, as I say, you will see yourself, 6 months down the road going, oh, how I view the Bible is completely different now than how I viewed it 6 months ago. But it does take a certain amount of developing that habit and discipline. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that helped. Very, very much appreciate your support. Okay, our next super chat is from Mouthwash for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. It's good to see you here tonight. Do you believe Pauline passages which sound like Plato are deliberately referencing him, like 1 Corinthians 13:12 from the Phaedo? Was Plato inspired by God? Okay, that's a very interesting thing, and we're just going to pop up that passage just to see what you're talking about. I have read the Phaedo. Here. Corinthians 13 and verse 12. Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, just as I also have been fully known. Okay. Now, it is true, Paul quoted Greek philosophers. This isn't the only example. He also quotes Epimenides. Okay. Now, this is the million-dollar question. Scripture is inspired, and Scripture quotes pagan sources. It does all through Scripture. This is not the first pagan source that's quoted it. There's others. There's many others. We find, say, the hymn of the Aten. I think it's Psalm 104 being quoted. So, we do find this. Now, here's the other thing, too, is Plato wasn't inspired by God. The pagan sources aren't inspired by God, but they have elements of truth. And that is sort of where we have to sort of do the divide. Okay? So even though Paul is quoting Plato here, Plato is not inspired, but Plato is showing us elements of truth. I think one of the problems we sort of get into as Western Bible readers is we get into this sort of black and white thinking of that almost becomes almost new to Scriptura, where we see if it's in the Bible, it's true. If it's outside the Bible, it's not true. But we find, because we think that the Bible is inspired, that someone quoted by the Bible must also be inspired. Not necessarily the case. What we have here is a case where the Pauline texts are inspired, but not everyone he's quoting is necessarily inspired. Yet, in this particular place, he is showing truth, and that truth is that it's not really. We have to also keep in mind that when we talk about inspiration, it's not that the text itself is, but that the writing process is inspired. Okay? So there's a little confusion here over what we mean by inspired too. Okay? The authors are inspired. The texts are true. Okay? So this is sort of one of the dichotomies here between inspiration and inerrancy. So this is where we have to be a little careful about how we define our terms also. Texts are God-breathed, they're true, but authors are the inspired portion, not the texts. Okay? So, because of this, the when the inspired writer goes to write the text, he's been prepared all his life for this task. His life has been directed by God. He's read certain things. He's had life experiences. He's held jobs and done work. He's had tragedies and triumphs in his life. He's had certain teachers. Paul was trained by the great Jewish sage Gamaliel. He had the best training. He had the best training in Judaism. He's your Harvard League Jew. He comes out of a Harvard League kind of Judaism. So he had the best. And God used this. That's the inspiration portion. So that when Paul puts pen to paper, what he is saying is going to be inerrant. Because even then, when he quotes a pagan source to support his argument, Paul's citing his sources. He's using what people in the culture know is true to support what is true. So, I don't think Plato was a prophet. I don't think he was an inspired writer. Not everything Plato said was true. Okay? But he had elements of truth in what he wrote. So that's where sort of the balance lies here, is that an inspired writer can take stuff that is true from other sources and interact with it. He can interact with it to create a text that is God-breathed. Okay? So I hope that sort of fleshes this out for you. Thank you very much for the super chat, and I hope that answered your question. Thank you so much. It's a great question. It's a good question. This is one of the reasons why, for example, I rail a bit when it comes to people who want to take First Enoch, and because it's quoted in, say, certain passages of Scripture, that people will then make, say, the mistake of saying First Enoch is also inspired, and it's not. It's not infallible. It's not inerrant. Again, this comes out of a confusion between inerrancy and inspiration. But there are elements of First Enoch that are referenced and interacted with, because that interaction leads to some form of truth. So I disagree with some people who go, say, beyond, who really sort of do sort of the whole nosedive into studying First Enoch like it was Scripture, because it is quoted in Scripture, because it's not Scripture. So, it's complicated. It is complicated. But you do have to try to at least keep this stuff straight. And it can be confusing, because we do understand that there is a relationship between inspiration and inerrancy, but it's not synonymous. One's a process, one's a result. Inspiration's a process. Inerrancy is the result. So anyway, thank you very much for that super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Down. Twitch is here. Okay. All right. Linguist Ammo for $5. Good to see you tonight. He says, I'm halfway through the video with Costa and Petrovich, and geez, I need an aspirin and a nice glass of Lafroig. Does he know what he's talking about? Oh, I saw that interview. Wow. If you're only halfway through it, it gets worse. It gets much, much worse. You're not going to need the glass of Lafroig. You're going to need the bottle. And then you're going to have to resist throwing the bottle at your monitor. Yeah, that was a train wreck. That was a complete train wreck. Um, uh, I don't even know if Costa realizes how bad that looked. I mean, that looked really really bad. But he invited Petrovic back for a second interview, so he obviously didn't realize how terrible that really was. But who knows? Yeah, I thought it was. I thought it was. I did not think it was a good look. It was. I mean, it was full of error. Um, and I'll just leave it at that. Anyone who wants to look that um, Costa and Petrovic interview, and he was on. It was on like the date of the Exodus and the early alphabetic inscriptions. They don't call it early alphabetic inscriptions. I think they call it like Proto Hebrew or something really bizarre like that. Yeah, it was horrible. I mean, I have respect for Costa too, but man, this was not good. This was really, really not good. Um, I think part of the problem was that Costa doesn't understand the material well enough to really engage this on the level it needs to. I mean, I think he's got a degree in is it archaeology or anthropology or something like that or history. I mean, I don't know Costa's full credentials. I know he holds a PhD, and I think it's from the University of Toronto. And mileage really varies on that. I've seen some people from the who graduated from the University of Toronto be very good. I've also seen some really, really lackluster people come out of U of T. So, you know, he says, "Yeah, it was Proto Hebrew," and I paused the video and said, "No, no, that's not how that works." Yeah, that's not how it works. But Petrovic has made some really incredulous statements, that are just, you do actually wonder if he does know what he's talking about. Like that Gershon Galil inscription, the curse tablet, not the one at Mount Ebal, but the one in Jerusalem. That's supposed to be late Bronze Age. And Petrovic had said that, oh, that's Hebrew, that's early Hebrew. While everyone started going, that's a Jebusite city, right? So um, I'm not going to say much more about this unless people can go watch it for themselves and make up their own opinions of this. But um, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. Um, he never really was a reader to begin with, and you can sort of see the decay start to set in on some of his scholarship at this point. So that's where I'm going to sort of leave it at this point. But yeah, it was not a good look. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I very very much appreciate it. Um, I'm sorry you have to endure that. That's going to be painful. Okay. Our next super chat is from Lou. $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Did Egyptians really come from the land of Punt? No. Okay. Punt is in Ethiopia. Um, it's in sub-Saharan Africa. Egyptians seem to have more or less come from, say, North Africa, and the Levant. They're a classification of people that used to be called Hamido-Semitic, or in more modern terms, Afro-Semitic. They're sort of a blend, because frankly, Egypt is at a crossroads. Okay, it's a crossroads between northern Africa and the Levant, and there was a lot of interchange of material of people and materials between the regions. Okay, now there is also some people movements from, say, sub-Saharan Africa. Wow, I am just tongue twisting tonight. I really should have had that whiskey. Oh, I had dinner before, so he's freaking out. I don't normally get dinner during it before a live stream. He doesn't know what to do with food and drink. Okay. So anyway, there was also some people migration from sub-Saharan Africa northwards into Sudan and into Upper Egypt, particularly in the region of Kush. Okay, and that's around the first or second cataracts. Okay, so there is a blending of people, but by the time you get to, say, Thebes, the ethnographic markers really change. Okay, when you're in Kush, you still have, say, those sub-Saharan African traits, which is why you find people in Kush having darker skin. And that's actually a trait you still see in Egyptians living there today, say modern Egyptians. But once you hit Thebes, it does seem to the ethnographic traits do tend to take on more of a Semitic quality. So, no, they don't really come from Punt, because Punt is down in Ethiopia. But they are a blend of people. They're a blended people. Basically, many different ethnicities are contributing to the melting pot. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. It's a difficult topic because you can't say they just came from one place. You'd like to say they come from Africa, but then you get that Semitic blend also. So, it's a difficult question to answer. It really is. And it's also a contentious question because of Afrocentrism. There are people who get really hot under the collar about this. But all the genetic studies that have been done so far, the post-mortem studies of the mummies that we discovered, seem to lend to that sort of conclusion that it's a blended people. So anyway, thank you for the super chat, and I very much appreciate it. Yeah, one way said lay off the dinner. Yeah, probably. Okay. The camel leopard for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Shabbat shalom. Well, Shabbat shalom to you too. Does the prohibition against sorcery in the Bible include narcotics? Yes, it does to a certain extent. Now, this is more of going to be a New Testament thing than an Old Testament thing. And that's because the prohibition on sorcery is in the Greek called pharmakia. Now, sorcery does not necessarily include narcotics, but it can. And when it does include narcotics, it's really done specifically. The use here, it's a use case. The prohibition is a use case. And what I mean here by a use case is it's not a ban of narcotics in general. It's a ban on narcotics for religious purposes. Okay? So, what would be the use case here? The use case here would be, say, like a peyote trip. You do a dream walker session using peyote. So you're in a sweat lodge, you want to do a dream walking, and you take peyote to facilitate the religious experience. That would be a forbidden practice because you're using a pharmaceutical to achieve a religious end. Okay? People used to use LSD for the same purposes. People would use lysergic acid, LSD. Okay. they would use LSD to go on these sort of religious trips, for a religious experience. That would be a prohibition. But the prohibition is actually not so much against narcotics, it's against sorcery. It's a non-biblically prescribed religious practice. So we do have to be very, very careful here to say not focus so much on the narcotic as you have to focus on the sorcery. Okay? Because that's the real prohibition. The real prohibition is not on the narcotic. The real prohibition is on the sorcery, which just so happens to include the narcotics use within sorcery. So that's really what's meant by pharmakia. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. The fact is that narcotics do have legitimate medical purposes. And like, for example, codeine and morphine are used in the reduction of pain. They can be misused for other things. When it's used for the management of pain, that's entirely an acceptable biblical practice. When it's used to do, say, opium dreaming for a religious purpose, then it's unacceptable. So you have to keep that in mind, is that that there's a fine line here. There's a distinction that's made in the text. But there's no question that the practice of sorcery itself is forbidden. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay. The MRB for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Good to see you here tonight. Any merit in good attempts at comparative religion? Yes, absolutely. I think comparative religion is a good thing. I think comparative religion, when done properly, is excellent. I think that where it sort of stumbles is when one sort of says, okay, we need to go beyond, say, comparative religion. Now, comparative religion is when you take two religions and you compare them to see where they are similar and where they contrast. Okay? That's really a good thing to do. It helps you understand your religion. It helps you understand other people's religions. That's excellent. That's a proper use. It can help you understand the historical context of certain passages. That's a really good use. It's where the bad attempts sort of come in, is when you take comparative religion and say, well, it's not just similar, it's the same, or it's ripped off. Okay? That is a poor use of comparative religion, because then you're making a logical leap that is not necessarily suggestive of the ontology of any one religion. Like, for example, you can compare the Moses narrative and Moses being put in a reed basket to, say, the Sargon Akkad narrative of Sargon being placed in a basket. Of course, Moses is being placed among the reeds, where Sargon is just being chucked down the river, or rapidly flowing river, and the basket is just bobbing along, carrying him down. Okay. The comparative use, basically a good attempt of comparative religion would say, hey, there's a common cultural context here. This is the equivalent of, say, a baby in a basket being left on the church doorstep. Happens all the time. Same old story. It's a classic old story. The misuse of this would be saying, oh, Exodus rips off Sargon of Akkad. It's the same story. One stole from the other. That's a bad use because it made that logical leap. That leap in logic. That just because you have a common cultural context doesn't mean one story came from the other. So you do get both uses. And there's many, many good reasons to do comparative religion. As I said, context is one. If you're ever going to, say, work with new religious movements, you're going to need the tools of comparative religion to sort of have a dialogue with them. You're not part of their religion. You're not in their other religion. So if you have to understand, in order to understand them, you have to talk to them. You have to say, hey, okay, is this where we're similar? Is this where we're different? And that involves the tools of comparative religion. Much of the study of new religious movements depends upon comparative religion. If you're having to ever compare denominations within Christianity itself, you're actually doing comparative religion. If you look at, say, what are the differences between Catholics and Protestants, or Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, you're going to be using the tools of comparative religion to do that. You're going to say, this is where they're same, this is where they're different in doctrine, this is where they're different in historical development. All of those are the tools of comparative religion. So there's lots of good attempts at comparative religion being made. And it's an important toolkit. It's a very, very important toolkit. So that, I hope, answers your question. It's a good question, a little broad, but it's an excellent question. And I highly encourage people to use comparative religion to define, to discover similarities and contrasts. Very useful. Very, very useful. I use it all the time. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. The Camel Leopard for $5 again. Thank you very much for the super chat. Is the Peshta reflective of Yeshua's native language? Now, if I recall right, that is that in Aramaic? It's been a long time since I looked at the Peshta. Yeah, it's in Aramaic. This is a really, really good question. And it speaks to something here that is actually a lot broad. It's a lot broader question than it sort of appears. There is. We have to kind of understand again where Yeshua lived. That's Jesus. He lived in Nazareth. He lived in Jerusalem, Capernaum, Bethesda. Judean foothills, essentially. He makes it to the coastal plain as well, but there's a crossroads of various different languages at play here. We do know that Aramaic was probably the common language of the local area. Okay, but Greek was also spoken. Okay, Judea at this point was fully Hellenized at this point. We also know that as a province of the Roman Empire, Latin was also spoken. It's very, very likely that Jesus was a polyglot. Now, we have to understand, when we talk about polyglots, they would have also, let's throw in the fourth one as well, which is Hebrew, and even some Edomian. Okay? There was even some Edomian in the whole language mix of, say, Judea. Okay, so you get all that language mix going on here. And you're going to get some strange effects. Now, we in North America are we're cursed. Most of us live in a monolingual culture. That has not been true for many places in the world. You know, you go to Switzerland and barmaids know 4 languages. Okay? It's not something that requires extraordinary ability. It just requires having grown up in the right culture. And people become polyglots often naturally. They often become polyglots naturally because of where they grew up. They're exposed to so many different languages growing up that they just sort of naturally pick them up. My grandfather, okay, he grew up in the Ukraine. Okay, he grew up in the Ukraine. He did not have a grade school education, but he could speak 4 languages. Okay, he could speak Hopdutch, Plattdeutsch, Russian, and English. Okay, he was not he was not an educated man, not even close to being an educated man. But he grew up in an area where so many different languages were being spoken that he just picked them up. And we have to understand that Jesus grew up in an area where you had 4 or 5 different languages being spoken. In that sort of situation, he's going to pick up a lot of different languages. He's going to pick up the liturgical language of Hebrew. He's going to pick up the native Aramaic. He's going to probably pick up some Greek and also some Latin. We don't find any direct evidence of him knowing Latin, but it would have been inevitable. You know, Romans were everywhere. You know, it just would have happened. But Jesus would have had very little direct contact with Romans. I mean, really, his main contacts with Romans were centurions, which he had contacts with on occasion, or Pontius Pilate. You know, Pontius Pilate probably would not have spoken Aramaic. He would have probably spoken Greek and Latin. So, you know, Pontius Pilate was a politician from Rome. He grew up in a Greek and Latin culture. So for him to have had, you know, a discussion with Jesus, there would have had to be a common language there. And that common language would have probably been Greek, possibly Latin. So, so I wouldn't say the Peshta is reflective of Yeshua's native language, because it probably at this point was not so much a native language, but it would have been suggestive of at least the Aramaic of that period. But we also know, too, that Jesus was fluent in many languages. I mean, he picks up the Isaiah scroll and reads it and explains it. He understands biblical Hebrew. So he knows many languages. He's a polyglot. Like many people in Judea were polyglots. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And I thank you very much for the question. It's a great question. Innovati says, your grandpa sounds like a cool guy. He was a scoundrel. That's okay. He was cool in his own way, but he was a scoundrel. And that's why we loved him. Okay. Let's see what's next here. The MRB for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Part 2. Should we try and reconstruct a proto-faith? No. No, I don't think it's really necessary to reconstruct a proto-faith. I think, let me put it this way. I think there is, I think you can celebrate God in the diversity of religion. And I don't mean outside of the Christian faith, I mean within Christianity. Okay? I do think that people who try to reconstruct a proto faith, and often this is reworded in such a way, well, we need to bring back the original Christianity of the early church fathers. No. The early church fathers were important in their day. They are important for their cultural understanding that helps us understand some biblical texts. But the way they do religion is not often what people think it is. And it really actually wouldn't even work terribly well for modern living. Now, what do I mean by that? You look at how, say, the original Christian church looked like, a quote, proto-faith. The way church was done was it was basically modeled after philosophical training schools. Not even so much synagogues, but philosophical training schools. More like, say, Platonic or Pythagorean training schools, where you have a teacher sitting on a stool and students sitting around his feet. They were in small groups, 6 or 8 students per teacher. As it grew, of course, they filled the room. But it was more that style. It also would not take into account, say, advances in theology. Now, one of the things is that we know from, say, the book of Acts, that the Holy Spirit would guide the disciples, apostles, and frankly, all believers into truth. Okay? Now, not every truth, and not necessarily all truth per individual, but as a collective. One of the things that church historians sometimes say is that the controversies in the Christian church is the Holy Spirit guiding the church into truth as a collective unit. Okay? So we have to take into account that we don't get all theological truths all at once. And just because, say, the early church had certain beliefs, some of those beliefs weren't actually true. And we have to be careful about this, because sometimes the church fathers misunderstood things. Like, for example, the Isaiah 7, the Emmanuel prophecy. You get some really weird readings of that in the early church fathers, because they did not understand the Syria-Ephraimite war. Okay. So there's some really strange stuff in the church fathers. Stuff that's just patently wrong. But it was their interpretation at the time. So I think we have to be very, very careful about this idea that a proto-faith can be, or a faith of the early church fathers, can be reconstructed, or even that such a thing is desirable. Because there's going to be theological reflection over time. And that theological reflection is going to result in church distinctives. And those church distinctives don't necessarily compromise the church, but actually add to it. And I think that's one of the things that's really, really important here, is that those distinctives can help define issues, it can clarify, it can raise valid concerns and valid points. And if you look, say, through the lens, the telescope of church history, we've got a lot clearer understanding of, say, the Bible looking back, because of all that controversy that the church went through, than those of the first 2 centuries had looking forward. So I don't think we should see this as modern expressions of faith as a liability, but I think we should see it as a part of a mosaic, part of the the tapestry of the Christian faith. And that's the tapestry that's important. And say my guiding verse here would be Revelation chapter 4, where it talks about all the saints who were before the throne, from every nation, every tongue. Every nation is going to have its cultural expression of Christianity. Every tribe is going to have its cultural expression. And even every language is going to have its cultural expression of the faith. These are to be celebrated. And I think just trying to reconstruct a proto-faith misses the point. So I can understand that where, you might want to do this. I mean, could be interesting. Could be interesting as sort of an intellectual exercise. That could be very interesting as an intellectual exercise. But I wouldn't put it into practice. And that's probably the sort of the difference here. So I wouldn't put it into practice, but it'd still be interesting. All right? So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. All right, Tony G for $19.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Pharaoh Falk. Really? Is it true the oldest Yahweh inscription is in a temple built by Amenhotep III in Soleb, Sudan? What is the context? How does this affect Exodus dating? So let it be written, so let it be done. Okay, I'm going to try to answer this without stumbling like I did on the last one of these inscriptions. Okay. The short answer is we're not exactly sure. Now, what we find at Soleb Temple is an inscription that says Ta Shasu Yahu, the land of the Shasu of Yahu. And it's in a captive circle. So a captive circle is a kind of a cartouche with the head of an Asiatic on top of it, basically to show that this is a circle that has been, a place that has been conquered by Amenhotep III. Okay? Now, it is true that that inscription does appear at Soleb Temple. But it's also true that we don't know exactly what Yahu means. It could be Yahweh. It could be a Yahwistic name, like Jehu. Like Jehu, the king, like, for example, the king of northern Israel, is spelled exactly the same way. Now, that's a theophoric name, so Yahweh could be in that. But we don't know exactly if that's what it means here. There's no determinative on this inscription to tell us it's a god, like we find in other inscriptions. So we don't know if it's a person, a deity, or a place name. Now, we do know that the whole captive circle is a place name, because it's the land of. The context is that this was one of the campaigns. It's a boundary temple that's just south of the Amara West temple. It dates to Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III dates from 1389 to 1351 BC. That's his dates. How does this affect the Exodus dating? Okay, it doesn't. This is not related to the Exodus at all. And here's the reason why. Okay. The Exodus. Now, I know guys like Caius Kennedy are going to try to argue that these are Israelites. But we know from this very similar inscription at the Amara Temple that this place is located in the kingdom of Edom. Essentially, they're people who are living in the region of Edom. The problem is we are told in the biblical text, Numbers 21 and 20, that the Israelites did not enter Edom or Moab. Okay? So because this is in Edom, this can't be Israelites. There's no possibility for these being Israelites. So with that said, this can't relate to an Exodus in any way. Now, what I think if it is, does refer to Yahweh, then these are essentially Midianites, Shasu, who worshipped Yahweh. Because we also do know from the biblical text that Moses' first encounter with Yahweh was in Midian. He's encountering him when he's living among the Midianites. And Midian back then included Sinai, Edom, and Saudi Arabia. So it was quite extensive back then. So I don't think this affects the Exodus in any way. These are not Israelites. These are basically a different group of people. Now, I know some people translate Shasu as nomads. That's a very, very poor translation. Very poor translation. Some of them were nomads, some of them weren't. They're just a tribal group known as Shasu. And I think we should just call them Shasu. So, anyway, I want to say here that I think it's an important inscription because it does tell us actually a lot about the Shasu, like where they're located. They're located in Edom. I think it's important for that reason. But I don't. It's just too vague. It's just too vague, and to say that this is the oldest Yahweh inscription, and it certainly doesn't tell us where the Israelites are. At this point, the Israelites are still in Egypt. They're still at Avaris. They're still making mud bricks for the Pharaoh. So that's what's happening during this period of time. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that helped, and I hope that answered the question. And hopefully I didn't bungle this one. So thank you very much, and I very much appreciate the super chat. Okay. And it's my name for 30, and I don't recognize the currency symbol, but thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. Egyptian colonies in China. Bohuzu compares Hebo versus Egyptian Hapi, Hathor and Weaver Girl, Festival of Al-Kiming Festival, Dragon Boat Festival versus Sham El Nassim. Okay. I have not read his article. Okay, I have not read his article. I personally do not think there were any Egyptian colonies in China. Now, with that said, there is some credibility that there was some trade between China and Egypt. There is, for example, we find silk in a tomb that dates to Ramses III. Okay? So there was probably some trade between Egypt and China. We do know that these trade routes were very extensive, and we're getting more and more of a appreciation. The yeah, Mr. The MRB says the any scholar doesn't recognize the shekel symbol. Yeah, well, yeah, I don't recognize the shekel symbol because it's a modern symbol. Of course, I don't recognize the shekel symbol. It's modern. Oh boy. Modern stuff, I don't know anything about that. 3,000 years ago. Oh yeah, I'm all on top of that. that's just okay. But to get back to the question here, so I'd have to read his article to really sort of get into this deep, but I doubt it. Honestly, I doubt it. There were lots of trade relationships without any sort of other, say, cultural interchange. So we do know that there were trading routes all through Egypt, from Africa, as I said, all the way into China. There was a lot of trade going on. A lot of trade. Because people wanted stuff from other nations. Other nations had nice stuff. And how you got nice stuff was you sent people out to trade it. You know, this is why Hatshepsut sent that trading mission to Punt, was to trade for gold and incense trees and exotic animals and exotic wood and lots of ore to continue the trading cycle. Okay, so you know, other countries had nice stuff. This is how Egypt procured it. We find cloves in the tomb of King Tut. Well, cloves don't grow in Egypt. They don't grow in Africa. They grow in India. That's the closest source. Lapis. There's lapis in the tomb of King Tut also, from Afghanistan. So we are recognized that there are very extensive trade routes that are happening in the ancient world. And we're only now sort of getting a grasp on how truly extensive they were. You know, they recently discovered a suit of Syrian armor in China. In North China, of all places. You know, what's a suit of Assyrian armor doing up there? So there is all this stuff going on. And it's all going on sort of under the radar and very, very quietly. But it's also sort of greasing the lifestyles of the very wealthy of the ancient world. So I don't necessarily think that Egypt had any colonies. I'd need much more evidence for this before I really accept this idea that there was an Egyptian colony in China. But people from Egypt could have gone to China to trade, or people from China to Egypt could have come and traded as well. It's possible. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I very, very much appreciate it. Okay, Sinaiacus Apologia for $100. Thank you very much for your really generous super chat again. Wow, very much appreciate your incredible support of our channel. Just means so much to us that you keep us going here. Just very much appreciate it. And he says, I have nothing interesting to ask this week. I'm taking 3 physics classes. Ouch. And I'm way too fried, exploding head. I'll try to think of something next week. Oh, dude, take it easy. Whoa. 3 physics classes. Yikes. Ouch. Oh, no, I never did that either. That's... Yow. When I was in college, I took 1 physics class, and it was, like, way too much for me. I barely passed my physics class. I mean, barely passed. That was not fun. Yeah, take it easy, relax. We appreciate the support, and we're grateful for your support. You know, you can always ask another question another time. But dang, 3 physics classes. Ow. Whew. Yikes. I'll pray for you. I will definitely be praying for you. Because that's a heavy load. That's a really heavy load. Wow. I'm impressed. I'm very impressed. Yeah, that's... The only thing I could say that was as heavy for what I did was when I took several language classes at the same time. That can get very heavy too. But yeah, that's a class of academic endeavor that's really quite rigorous. But anyway, I want to thank you very much for this very generous super chat. Again, I'll be praying for you. Wish and hope you do well. And very, very much appreciate the very generous support of this channel. We do so much appreciate it, and thank you so much. Okay. Mystery flavor for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do we have any sort of archaeological report of who the Rephaim were? Do a double check here. Staking that. Spell right here. Okay. We don't know. Yeah, they're inhabitants of the east of the Jordan. We don't really have a whole lot there, unfortunately. As far as I know, we don't have a lot. See if we... Yeah, there's not a whole lot here. They're living around the same places as the Ammonites, but we don't have much on them per se. It's one of the ethnic groups we know much less about, unfortunately. I don't even think we've even properly identified them, but I could be wrong here. Unfortunately, this is one of those areas where we're just going to have to say we don't know. We do know that it's included in the prohibition. Now, yeah, this is going to be when it talks about King Og in the gloss in Deuteronomy 3:11. It talks about Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. So Bashan. Yeah, so this is going to be an interpretive gloss that's added in some places. So this is going to be of an issue when it comes to, say, conquest. You know, people are going to encounter some of the Rephaim, but I don't think we have any clear idea who the Rephaim are at this point. I wish we knew more about this group, but we don't know a lot. There's been some archaeology done on, say, the east of the Jordan. Definitely on, say, west of the Jordan River into that area. We do find Canaanite sites there, but it's kind of hard at that point. We can make some distinction between, say, settlements that are settled by, say, Ammonites versus, say, Amorites. But when you start getting into smaller groups like the Rephaim, it's really difficult to sort of tell them apart from anyone else. So I don't think anyone's made a firm identification here of Rephaim sites, but I don't think there's a lot here. So that's just my impression. I don't know for sure because again, I don't one doesn't encounter Rephaim very often. It's one of those groups that's it's just so small, and it sounds even like they were in decline by the time Israel enters into the land. So unfortunately, we're going to have to say here we don't know. And that's probably sometimes the best we can do is I don't know. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. It's an interesting question. I've never really given the Rephaim much thought, but as far as I know, we don't know a lot about them. But again, somebody might have done some paper on them that I'm not aware of too, or have excavated a site that they've identified. But it would be a pretty obscure paper if it was. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, one way for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. It's good to see you here tonight. Bless you, Dr. Falcon Kiara. What do you think is going on in Leviticus 25:44-6? Trying to keep this broad, Dr. Falcon. Smiley face. Okay, let's look at the passage. Pull it up. And we're going to go to Leviticus 25. $44. Okay. Oh, you're going to ask me one on slavery. Lovely. Okay. He says, as for your... Let's see, is there any context here that I should know about? Okay. All right, let's just read the passage. As for your male and female servants whom you may have, you may acquire male and female servants from the pagan nations that are around you. Then, too, it is out of the sons of sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they have produced in your land, they may also become your possession. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. Okay. Essentially, there is a kind of, allowance here for the acquisition of slaves from foreigners. Okay. Now, there's a difference here in some cases. In the case of, say, pagan nations where they buy, say, slaves, these are slaves as a finished product. Now, they're already enslaved. They're already slaves in pagan nations. There's really no change in status here other than a transfer of property. Now, I'm going to basically qualify everything I say from here on with a slavery in the Old Testament is a very complicated topic. Massive amounts of literature are published on slavery in the Bible every year. You really have to keep up on this if you're going to focus on slavery as a topic, because there's just so much literature, secondary literature being done. Just so much. As I said, papers are done every year on slavery in the Bible. And if you don't keep up on that reading, you fall behind really fast. It's probably one of the most talked about subjects in the Old Testament. So you have to focus on this if you're going to make this. So anybody else who has not focused on this and keeps up with the literature, you're going to have to take with a grain of salt, including what I'm about to say. Just because the literature here is so vast, it's so broad, it covers so much topic. As a scholar, you're going to have to pick and choose what areas you focus on if there's a lot of literature being done on it. In my case, I focus on Exodus because that's sort of in my wheelhouse. That's the literature I focus on, and there's a lot being done on that. I can't divide myself between that and the topic of slavery, so I leave slavery to other sort of individuals. But I will comment on this as I best understand it, understand that take this with the proverbial grain of salt. Okay? So then, verse 25. Then, too, it is the sons of the sojourner who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition. Essentially, sojourners are foreigners, but they are resident aliens. Now, in a case of a sojourner, they're free people. They are allowed to graze their animals in the land. They're foreigners. They're permitted to stay. They're not slaves. Okay? They're not slaves. They're pasturing their flocks. Okay? They are moving through the land, and they are basically herding their flocks. So they don't have farming land. Sojourners don't have access to farmlands. So they're not grazing crops, but they are, say, nomadic peoples. However, That doesn't prevent a sojourner from getting into financial difficulties. They still have to trade their goods for cash and support their families by buying other items and trading for other items. So there is a time when sojourners can get into financial difficulty. When they get into financial difficulty, they can sell their family members into slavery. And that is where, this becomes an issue for the sojourner. Now, they're not Israelites. Because they're not Israelites, they don't fall under the convention of, say, brothers who are basically paying off a debt. So the year of Jubilee rule, the Jubilee rule doesn't kick in. The 7-year rule doesn't kick in. So they can become permanent possessions. Okay? And that's what's happening here in verse 46, where it says, "You may even bequeath them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over them, over one another." So there is here, 3 kinds of slaves being covered in 3 verses. Okay? You have the ones that are foreign, already enslaved, finished product, by pagan nations. They're selling them to you. They're bringing them to your doorstep, and they're selling them as finished goods. Okay? Then you've got the sons of sojourners, who get into trouble, have to get out of it. They might have to sell a son to keep feeding what family they have left. Okay? Those 2, because they are actually foreigners. They're slaves that are treated as foreign slaves. But they've also voluntarily sold themselves into slavery also, at least within their family group. The kid might not have had any choice whether or not he was sold into slavery by dad, but dad, who is the, say, the guardian, can make the choice on the behalf of the kid to sell his kid in slavery to save the family. So that's what's happening in the case of the sojourner who sells his kid in slavery. And then you've got, finally, the Israelite who has to sell himself into slavery to get out of debt. And he's released on the 7th year. Okay? So there's 3 different kinds of slavery happening here, and they're basically all being treated slightly differently. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. You did try to keep it broad, and I appreciate that, because, again, this is not my field of expertise. It's a specialized field, and, again, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat, and I very much appreciate it. All right, next one. Let's see here. Is from Faye of the Duat for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. I see Mr. E's empty conjecture in the background. Illusion shattered. Oh no! Oh no! Ah! Oh, well, we decided we want to start putting Mr. Empty Conjecture on display. So this is the first time we've put Mr. Empty Conjecture in the background. He's part of the ancient Egypt and the Bible family. So, we thought, okay, we got a stand here. We could set him up back there. We'll have to dust him off because he's sitting on a computer and it gets a little dusty there. But, yeah, we thought this would be a pretty cool addition to add to the background here. Something that's very that's near and dear to the hearts of our subscribers. So, yeah, absolutely. He's back there and he's staring at us. Little disturbing. But You just told me Santa doesn't exist. Oh no, I would never do that. It could have been worse. We could have mummified him. We could have made a little cartonnage mummy of him. He's staring into my soul. Yeah, he kind of has that effect, doesn't he? Okay. Yeah, that was fun. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And we do love Mr. Empty Conjecture. We would love to someday do like t-shirts or coffee mugs of Mr. Empty Conjecture. You know, we're not a merch channel. We don't like pitching merch, but we've had so many requests for Mr. Empty Conjecture t-shirts and mugs that it's just like, okay, now I want one. It's like, yeah, I don't care if anyone else buys it. I want a Mr. Empty Conjecture t-shirt and mug. So we're thinking about it. We just don't know how to go through the process. So uh, it turned out to he turned out to be a very popular character, very very popular character. It's just and he's been useful. He's been useful many times on Popcorn Reviews. Okay. I think we're getting close to the end of the super chats here. Here's one from Eddie P for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Is it necessary for Scripture to be inerrant? Can it be authoritative and errant? Ooh. Ooh. Well, that is a very interesting question. Is it absolutely necessary for Scripture to be inerrant? That's a very difficult question. Can it be authoritative and errant? Well, here's the thing. The problem is how to determine inerrant. Now, my personal view on this is it's one of those things that's almost sort of a dogma kind of issue. It's an issue of dogma. And what I mean by this is it's not, say, a full doctrine of the Christian church, but many sort of denominations accept this as dogma, which is they believe it. It's a belief that's sort of passed down. It's kind of hard for it to be both authoritative and errant. Okay, errant meaning it has errors in it. Can it be authoritative and still have errors in it? Well, in one sense, yes. In one sense, yes. Which is in the sense that there's errors in copying. But that's not sort of what people mean, theologians mean when they talk about inerrant. When theologians talk about the Bible, Scripture being inerrant, they mean that it's without error in the autographs, the original writings. Now, the fact is that we don't have the autographs. All we have today is copies. We have copies of the autographs. Now, you can use text criticism to try to determine what the original reading was, and then from there say, okay, that original reading is inerrant. So in a sense, all the copies we have today are both authoritative and errant, but it isn't what is meant normally by the dogma of inerrancy. The dogma of inerrancy would be that Scripture is authoritative and inerrant in the autographs. Okay? So now then we get to, say, the practical dogma, the praxis of inerrancy. And this is a little different again, where it's practically inerrant. What do we mean by practically inerrant? We mean that when you start figuring out what the original autographa says, well, almost every instance of this shows itself to be without error. Well, if it's practically inerrant to the extent that you can't find an error, at least not once you've considered, say, all the text critical sources, then it might as well be inerrant. So it's a doctrine that comes out of a dogma that comes out of sort of the practical exegesis of the Scripture itself. So when you look at this, when canon was originally formed, they were basically looking at these documents, these books, various books, and saying these ones have error and therefore disqualify themselves. So anything that disqualified themselves was excluded from canon, just sort of administratively. So there is a sense in which it can be authoritative and errant, but practically it ends up not being errant. So it's the question then becomes, well, then is that dogma really necessary? That's the $1 million question. That's going to be the $1 million question when it comes to inerrancy. Is it necessary to hold that doctrine? And many Christians in the past haven't. So I don't think it's one of those dogmas that's necessary, but it's also sort of very practically true as well. Yeah. Well, when you do say the process of, say, lower text criticism, and that's not a term that's really used these days in text critical circles, but it still has its use because you're not talking about then, say, form criticism or redaction criticism and those other sort of, say, more hypothetical forms of criticism. But you are comparing multiple sources, like the Septuagint, like the Masoretic text, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, like the Samaritan Pentateuch, and then basically comparing them to try to figure out what the original reading was. Okay, you might see spelling errors in one, you see spelling differences in another, and you sort of try to figure out what's the original reading by saying what's the closest, what makes sense for the reading to be original. Okay. Okay, so all the copies we have some sort of update or mistake, whether it's an update in, say, a form of the word, whether it's just a typo in spelling, whether it's an exclusion or a scribal gloss that was added. So the whole sort of task of the textual critic is trying to find what is as close to the original source. So, so then you've got a whole different here. So within that, there is that understanding that the copies that we have do contain errors. Okay, but they're typos. They don't. None of these errors affect, say, any doctrine. Most of them don't affect anything, to be honest. they're little changes in spelling, the vast majority of them. So they don't count really. And really, when you talk about the doctrine of inerrancy, it's not even talking about those. It's talking about deeper errors of content within the text. So that's really what it's talking about here, is that dogma is talking about errors of content, errors of history, errors of what actually transgressed. And those are a lot more, those are a lot fewer. Those are a lot fewer. And if any can be claimed at all, honestly. So, I've heard lots of skeptics claim them. A lot of these are problems end up being problems of interpretation. They're misreading the text. We went over one tonight, which is a supposed contradiction of David in 1 Samuel 17 killing Goliath, and then Elkanah in 2 Samuel 21 killing a guy named Goliath. Well, you read the text carefully, you find out they're different Goliaths. Okay? It's not a contradiction because there's an explanation between the two texts. So, reconciling the text is part of an exegete's job, and determining, what is, a error in a copy versus what is probably in the autographs is also the job of a good exegete as well. So that whole necessary thing is going to be debated. But the copies we have do have small mistakes, and it's still authoritative for faith and doctrine. So this is one of those things where it's yes to both. Is it necessary for Scripture to be inerrant? In the autographs, probably. Can it be authoritative and errant? Yes, in the copies. So, yeah, it's going to be kind of both. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. And I think that's our last super chat here. Okay, it's 10:30. We still have some time for non-super chats, so we are going to go back and we are going to go looking for non-super chats, and we are going to take as many questions as we can until we run out of questions that interest me or it hits 11. And then I'm definitely calling it a night. All right. I don't know if I have a good answer to this question, but I'll post it anyway. Swiftsy asks, if you went back in time to the Exodus, what would be the first thing you would ask Moses? First thing I would probably ask Moses is, what was it like living in the palace at Avaris? What was it like living with, say, Ramses I when he was vizier? What was the day-to-day life like? These are not details that are captured in the Bible. So that's what I would ask. What was it like to live back then in that particular setting? So that'd be probably what I would ask. But that would probably be the first thing. I might also ask, what was the name of your adopted mother? Who is she related to? That would be very interesting. Is she a sister of Seti the First? Is she, was she a daughter of Seti the First? We don't know. We don't know. So, we do know by the time Seti the First Ramses the First came to the throne, Seti the First was already an adult. So, and actually, Ramses the Second had already been born. So, so that would be my question. My question would be, who was Moses' adopted mother? What's her name? Can we find where she's buried? That sort of stuff. So fill in some of those details that the Bible doesn't tell us about. It'd be fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So that's what I would ask Moses if I met him face to face. So thank you very much for the question. Okay. Another non-super chat here. The Bible exegete asks, in your opinion, where do you place Mount Sinai? Okay. We're not exactly sure, but it does seem to be in the Sinai Peninsula. Okay. The reason why is because Moses encounters God at Mount Horeb. And in Exodus 3, Moses was said to pasture his flocks west of the wilderness of Midian. Midian is that that eastern part of the Sinai, Edom, and Saudi Arabia. Okay, so that's ancient Midian. If he's west of that, then he has to be in the Sinai Peninsula. So it's probably somewhere in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula. I would say it's probably connected in some way to the Wadi Faran. That the wadi that goes sort of east to west across the Sinai. So I don't know exactly. There's many mountains in that area that it could be. There's several possible candidates in the middle of the Sinai that it could be Mount Sinai. But I don't think we can know for sure, because all those Sinai's are all those mountains are so much alike. They're so much alike, and no one has done a proper archaeological survey of that area. We do know that the Israelites stayed at Mount Sinai for a year, but we just don't know exactly which one it is. So anyway, thank you very much for the question, but it is definitely in the Sinai Peninsula. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Because we do also know where the Yam Suf is as well. That's in the northwest Sinai. So it has to be in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula somewhere. So thank you very much for the non-super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, there is. We have another super chat here from Vic M for $20 Canadian. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Please see question in the chat box. Okay. One down. Okay, did you get a chance to have a look at the recent Bezor article, The Kirbid Kefea Ostraca, a new collation based on multispectral images with translation and commentary? No, I have not. And part of it, I might actually have it sitting beside me here. Bezor here. I've got a backlog of journals right beside me here that I haven't caught up on my reading. To be honest. Bezor. This is May 2022. Excuse me a moment. All right. Let's see here. Gee. Philistine pottery, coins. Okay, it's not. It's not in Maze. I got my Darcy down here. Journal of Cuneiform Studies. I've got my Journal of Near Eastern Studies. I haven't read it yet. I have to find it. Okay. Okay. You can tell I'm a little bit behind on my journal reading. So I can't comment on it. I haven't read it yet. But I will look for it after this. I promise I'll look for it. And if you want to ask me the question next time after I've actually hunted it down and actually read it, I'd be more than happy to comment on that point. Okay. So please feel free to ask this again as a non-super chat next time, and I'll get you an answer. Okay, that's the best I can do. As I said, I'm a little behind on my reading. Yeah, you saw me just tear open the package out of base store there, so that sort of tells you the state of how I live. So, but anyway, I want to thank you very much for that super chat. I very, very much appreciate it, and we will get you an answer next time. Okay, so thank you very much. Very much appreciate. But do remember to post that question so we remember to take care of it. And you could post that question really early. So we usually get our thumbnail up either Tuesday or Wednesday, and I scan the live chat for non-super chats and super chats as well. I got to clip them out. So you can post that question once the next thumbnail goes up. We'll screenshot it and we'll include it in the non-super chats at the beginning of the session. Okay? So anyway, I want to thank you again for that super chat. I really appreciate it. However, I just haven't read it yet. So thank you so very much. Okay. So let's go back to some non-super chats. Okay. Still scanning here for ordinary non-super chat questions. Okay, I'm going to go up to the beginning here because there seems to be not very much going on there. We might call it an early night because there's no questions. Oh dear. I've answered all of them. I know I haven't, but oh, all right. Actually, I found a couple here. Take this one. Wait, did we? Did we miss one? Miss a super chat? Oh, yes, we missed a super chat. Okay. That's glad we scanned this. Michael Eterno for $5 Canadian. We did miss that for some reason. Sorry about that. Can you explain the context of Exodus 4:24 to 25, the whole circumcision fiasco? Okay. Yes. Let's get the Bible up. Exodus 4. 24 to 25. Okay, verse 24. Now it came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him being Moses, and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet and said, she said, "You are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me." End quote. Okay. here's what's going on in the text. Now, we have to understand here that circumcision is part of the Abrahamic covenant. It's part of the Abrahamic covenant. And it was supposed to be passed down through all generations. Now, circumcision happened in Egypt because the Egyptians practiced circumcision. Okay? It's interesting that you call it this sort of whole circumcision fiasco because that's really what it was. It was a fiasco. And the Midianites did not practice circumcision. You know, even though many of them were considered descendants of Abraham through Ishmael, they were not considered. They were not under that same Abrahamic covenant, so they didn't practice circumcision. So Moses starts living among the Midianites. You know, he has a family. He, he has children, and he doesn't circumcise them. He's not following the Abrahamic covenant. He's going to bring his family back to Egypt, back to the people of Israel, and this is going to be a stumbling block. This is going to be a stumbling block. The Israelites are going to say, well, why do we need to be circumcised when your kids aren't? Moses is not leading by example. He's not leading by example. And he doesn't have the guts to do it himself. So Zipporah is basically saying that, hey, I understand what's going on here. I understand what's going on. You're not man enough to do this job. So you have made me do the dirty work. This is why she calls him a bridegroom of blood. Because he's making her do the nasty job. The job that she was never supposed to do. He was supposed to do this. He abrogated his responsibility. And this is why God wanted to put him to death. Because, he had chosen him, but at the same time, too, he was disobeying. And Zipporah essentially saves his life. She saves his life. Okay? She's basically telling him, you owe me now. You owe me. I saved your life. I saved your children's lives. Because your God is now angry. Because you didn't keep the covenant that was put upon Abraham. And you didn't even keep the customs of the Egyptians. So you're doubly guilty here. If he had just followed the customs of his forefathers, of even the Egyptians, this fiasco would have never happened, essentially. So that's sort of what's going on, as I best understand it in this passage, is that he hasn't done what he's supposed to do, and she has to do it. She's doing man's work here. She's doing what he should have done. Just so that he doesn't become a stumbling block between God and the people. Because we have to remember here, Moses is supposed to become the intermediary between God and the children of Israel. He's a representative. He's God's representative on planet Earth to the Israelites. So if he's not behaving the way he should, that's going to be a problem. Yeah, it's one of those things where we have, say, this is one of those sort of what's it called now? Criteria of embarrassment. Where the weaknesses of Moses. He's not being lauded as a heroic figure through the Old Testament. He's a murderer. He abrogates his duty. He lets women do what he should be doing. He's got a lot of weaknesses. He's got an anger problem. He's got an anger management problem. He's not a heroic type, but he's still being used by God for God's glory. And he was very lucky, you know, that, he had a woman that was, courageous enough to do this. Now, mind you, this also does seem to imply that um, that her son was, let's just say, a child, probably not an adult. Just because this would have been very, very awkward otherwise. So it does also seem to imply that her son here, was not of, say, adult age. So, there's other implications of this text as well, but that's the major implication. That, she's doing what he should have done, and because of that, she saves his life. Thank you very much for the super chat. I'm glad we caught it, and I'm glad we were able to address it. So, thank you so very much, and very much appreciate the super chat. Okay. Okay. Uh, I'll take this question. Michael Lucerno asks another one here that I think is actually kind of interesting. Did the Egyptians believe in curses surrounding their pharaohs' tombs? Yes, to some extent. Okay. Now, it is true that the tombs are protected with magical warding, but it's also a different kind of curse too. Now, people were actually allowed to enter the tombs of kings. Okay, this was actually allowed, and it's permitted. There is both a public and private section of most tombs. In the public section, you find, say, the biography of the king. You find his votive statues. You would leave your food offerings in the public section. It's a public place. Now, this is the antechamber, and most tombs had this. Had an antechamber that was open to the public. The burial chamber, where the king himself was actually buried, was private. That was private. And it's in that chamber it was forbidden to enter. Now, at the same time, too, we find on some tombs curses like a curse upon this person if they entered my tomb while they're ritually impure. So we do find that kind of curse, where it's not so much entering the tomb that's so much the crime, or the sin, but it is more that entering the tomb while being ritually unclean is the problem. So we do find some curses in tombs, but it's not usually for breaking and entering. It's usually for defiling the tomb, for whether by ritual impurity or by tomb robbing. Now, that happened. So, we do find some curses that apply to tomb robbing as well. Okay, so we do find some curses in Egyptian tombs, but it's not just for entry. You have to do something else bad. Because people could come in and they were allowed to look. In fact, we do actually have some inscriptions by Wasit, son of Ramses II, as he enters a person's tomb. And, he says, I have entered this tomb. This tomb is in great order. Love the inscription. I made a copy of it for the royal court. So we have some inscriptions from him, of him entering tombs to look around. So we do find this. So we do see this, and it is a very, very It is something that is allowed, but there are curses for if you're badly behaved while you're in a tomb. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. So again, I'm looking for questions with a Q and a colon at the beginning. So, let's see. I think we're getting pretty close to the end here. Um, take this one. Which one? Which one is this? Super chat. M. No, I don't think I did. It might not have shown up on my scroll up here on the. No, I have. That didn't show up on mine. I think my. I'll have to start and stop this again. I think my widget malfunctioned. This again. All right, got it. Okay, Vic N for $10 Canadian. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do you think the drawing on the Umbalad ostraca is the earliest depiction of Moses discovered so far? It's in an article by Pauline Clavigny. I haven't read the article, and I'm not familiar with the Umbalad ostraca, so I'd have to probably say defer this question until I read this, because I just don't know here. So it must have been fair. Yeah, so we got a couple here from next week here. Again, ask this question in as a non-super chat when the thumbnail goes up, and I'll definitely look into this. So, I do appreciate people posting questions early in the week, so that way I do have time to research, say, more complicated stuff like this. So, and the fact is, there's so many ostraca out there that it's hard to keep track of them all. So you kind of have to sometimes go, well, okay, this is not an ostraca I'm familiar with. So, you got to look it up and you got to say, okay, and then assess it. So, again, post this again in this as a question next week. Again, a non-super chat will suffice here. And I'll be more than happy to take this, okay, once I've read the article. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. Mr. MRB. Are Egyptian obelisks like the Min symbol? Did the Israelites build them? Okay. Second question, no. Israelites did not build obelisks as far as we know. That's because they require large granite quarries. Or sorry, not granite. Limestone quarries. And you don't find a lot of really, really sort of limestone in Israel that's really suitable for this. So they didn't do obelisks as far as we know. The second thing is, no. They're not a sort of symbol. Okay? They're not the sort of symbol that represents the male member. It's not what they represent. They are basically, think of them more like a pyramid. So they're a solar symbol. They harken back to Dynasty 5 and the Sun Temples. The Sun Temples basically had they were a raised platform, and at the end of the platform was kind of this squat tower pillar with a pyramid on top, and it was meant to be a solar symbol of the god Re. So these are solar symbols. They're not male anatomy symbols. Okay. So what happened was, instead of continuing to build sun temples, the kings of Dynasty 18 started building, you know, even Middle Kingdom. There's even a couple of Middle Kingdom obelisks. Started doing these long, tall versions of these obelisks that were continue to be solar symbols. And you can kind of understand why they're solar symbols. Because one of the interesting things is, you go to Egypt and you look at an obelisk, and you got the sun beating down on you. Well, it's got this weird shadow that sort of radiates around the symbol. It's kind of almost like a sundial. It's almost like a sundial. So, and it's a very striking shadow. Very striking shadow. So it's like a shadow that sort of scans across a temple or a courtyard. So, it's a very interesting effect. Very interesting effect. But they're definitely solar symbols. And if you read the inscriptions on obelisks, they're all dedicated to a sun god. Whether it's Atun Re or Amun Re, they're all dedicated to a sun god. So they're definitely solar symbols. They're not fertility symbols or male anatomy symbols. So anyway, that's a good question. It's a good question. I can see where you could possibly think that, but it's not that kind of symbol. So thank you very much for that question. Very much appreciated. Okay. And I think we're going to make that the last question tonight, because we've just hit 11 o'clock. So we're going to call it a night here. I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. We went a good 3 hours. That's a pretty good run. I want to thank everyone who donated a super chat tonight. You guys really help keep us going financially. So very much appreciate it. It's just a deep honor to be able to answer your questions, and we do so appreciate you supporting this. It helps continue the research. It helps continue the ministry of answering questions. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters who donate without expecting much in return. We really appreciate your support. We're so grateful for all you guys do for us, and we just love that you have been so sacrificial in your support of us. So we really want to give a shout out to our Patreon supporters. And finally, I want to thank our subscribers and our viewers who do comments, hit likes, who hit dislike. That helps the algorithm too. So we really appreciate your interaction and your dedication to watch our channel. Really helps promote our videos. And even to those subscribers who say cross-post our videos to other social media platforms, we appreciate that also, because that gets the word out. So with that said, we want to thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you, and we will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Have a great night.